In Parshas Vayeitzei, the Torah discusses about Avraham, about Yakov leaving Eretz Yisrael and going to his uncle Lavan, and his marriage and the children that he had. And he marries two sisters, Rachel and Leah. And the question that everybody raises, it's true that at Ben Noach, there is no problem marrying two sisters who share one, who are sisters by virtue of their father. But the question is, we know that the Avos, they observed Kol HaTorah Kula. So the Gemara in Yuma says that the Avos observed even rabbinic laws. So how is it that Yakov was able to marry two sisters? Now the Nefesh Chaim, he presents a mystical approach to that question. And he says that when a person does mitzvos, the observance of the mitzvahs can be viewed from two perspectives. One perspective is that it's a mitzvah, it's a command. We submit, irregardless of the implication, irregardless of what the mitzvah accomplishes or doesn't accomplish. We have to submit to the halacha. But that was only from the time of Matan Torah and onward. Prior to Matan Torah, with a few exceptions, the reason the Avos, the reason the Patriarchs observed the mitzvahs of the Torah, according to the Nefesh Chaim, is because in the observance of the mitzvahs of the Torah, man has the ability to control the upper worlds that then control the lower worlds. An example, the Nefesh Chaim says that in the lower worlds, the Romans and the Babylonians were only able to destroy the Beis HaMikdash after the Jews, the Jewish people, destroyed the Beis HaMikdash in heaven. In other words, it was the deeds of the Jewish people in Eretz, the deeds of the Jewish people that had an impact from a mystical perspective on the upper worlds, which then allowed the enemies of the Jewish people to destroy the Beis HaMikdash in the lower worlds. So he said that the giving of the Torah did not yet take place, with certain exceptions, in the time of the Avos, in the time of the Patriarchs. The reason the Patriarchs observed the mitzvahs of the Torah was because of the impact that the mitzvahs that they performed would have in the upper worlds, which would then have an effect in the lower worlds. And he said, therefore, through their Ruach HaKodesh, they were able to tell that there were certain times that situations necessitated in heaven not following the halacha, not following what later would be the halacha, but once the halacha was given as a halacha, as a law at the time of Matan Torah, then there is no excuse and no reason to go against the mitzvos of the Torah. So he says, Yaakov apparently came to understand that it was necessary, obviously not at the very beginning, but it was necessary for him in terms of bringing about the future of the Jewish people to marry both Rachel and Leah. And since halachically at that point, before Matan Torah, it was allowed, so that was an exception. That was an exception to the general rule. And he said that's also Yaakov, you see, made a matzeva. Actually, in this week's Sedra, a matzeva is something that was prohibited. A monument. We have only a mizbeach, only an altar. But Yaakov took one stone, that's a matzeva, and he poured oil on it. And he dedicated it. So but Yaakov only was able to do that because there was a special need at that time. The setting up of a matzeva from a mystical perspective. However, the most famous answer as to how Yaakov was able to marry two sisters is the answer of the Ramban. The Ramban says that while it is true, he said, the mitzvos of the Torah were not yet obligatory, with certain exceptions, bris milah being an exception. But the general mitzvahs of the Torah were not yet obligatory on the Jewish people. They only became obligatory at the time of the giving of the Torah. So he says, but the Avos, the Patriarchs, chose to observe it. He said they knew the sodos, the secrets of the mitzvos, but he said they chose to do so only in Eretz Yisrael, only in the land of Israel. The war mitzvos that they observed outside the land of Israel also, but they didn't feel a compulsion to observe the mitzvos of the Torah outside the land of Israel. And the question is, why not? I think many, many years ago when I was a boy, I read in one of the Svarim of Rabbi, I think it was Rabbi Chana Wasserman, I'm not sure. I don't have those Svarim now, I wasn't able to check. But I think Rabbi Chana Wasserman applied the same logic as Reb Chaim Volozhiner in the Nefesh HaChaim to the words of the Ramban. What Rabbi Chanan, I think was Rabbi Chanan suggested was that doing the mitzvos in the Torah, doing the mitzvos of the Torah, which in order that they should have an impact in the upper worlds of heaven, the mystical perspective of the mitzvos, rather than the halachic perspective of the mitzvos. So those mitzvos have to be performed in Eretz Yisrael. As a matter of fact, the Ramban in Chumash Dvarim emphasizes very much that the real fulfillment of the mitzvos is only in the land of Eretz Yisrael, not outside the land of Eretz Yisrael. But we are required to fulfill the mitzvos outside the land of Eretz Yisrael, the Ramban says, in order that we shouldn't forget them when we return to the land of Eretz Yisrael. Obviously, this needs to be understood. So Rabbi Chana Wasserman apparently understood it to mean that as a command, as a submission to the word of God, we have to observe the mitzvahs wherever we are. For whatever reason. But in order to perform the mitzvos that they should have an impact in the upper worlds, they have to be performed in Eretz Yisrael. And this could be understood The Gemara in Menachos talks about the seeds that were used, the seeds of grain that were used to bake the Shtei Halechem, the Shavuot sacrifice, and they had to be only from the land of Israel. And depending which Rishon and which Achron you understand, the Gemara raises the problem. Is it only from the land of Israel? But let's say if seeds of grain miraculously came from the heavens. So would we be able to use it also? In other words, there's a certain identification between the heavens and the land of Eretz Yisrael. So in a sense, because of that identification, the mitzvos that are performed in the land of Eretz Yisrael have a special impact in the upper worlds of heaven. Now, I personally think that there is a different explanation to the Ramban. Now, the Rambam in the Sefer Mitzvahs, I've mentioned this before, the Rambam in the Sefer Mitzvahs cites a Shifri Zuta. Now, there is an argument between the Rambam and the Ramban. The Ramban's opinion is that the mitzvah of tshuva, the mitzvah of changing one's ways for the better, is a mitzvah d'oraisa. It's a requirement. I remember years ago, Rav Wernick, the mashgiach at the Hebrew Theological College, he once said to me, "How does one do tshuva for not doing tshuva?" What he meant was that there is a mitzvah to do tshuva. Besides the fact that we have to do tshuva because we want to rid ourselves of our sins, there is a requirement to do tshuva. Certainly according to the Ramban. But then there's another mitzvah. There's a mitzvah vidui, of reciting the vidui prayer, of admitting to our sin and committing ourselves not to return to our sinful ways. And according to the Ramban, those are two separate mitzvahs. And it goes without saying, if you don't do the mitzvah of tshuva, you can't do the mitzvah of vidui. But according to Reb Chaim, the Rambam considered them as one mitzvah. The mitzvah of vidui and the mitzvah of tshuva is one mitzvah, one and the same. There are those who say other things. But the mitzvah of tshuva, the mitzvah of vidui is one mitzvah. And the Gemara, the Sifri Zuta says, I would say that in order to fulfill the mitzvah of vidui, and according to Reb Chaim's explanation, the mitzvah of tshuva as well, one has to recite the vidui in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. But in the Tochacha it says that the Jewish people in Chutz La'aretz, the Jewish people who went into exile because of their sins, will reach a point where his vadu eschatosam veschatos avosam, they will say vidui. They will ask for forgiveness. They will admit to their sins, as well as the sins of their ancestors who lived in Eretz Yisrael. So we see that vidui can be recited even outside the land of Israel. But if not for this pasuk, if not for this verse of the hisvadu eschatosam veschatos avosam, I would have said, on the basis of logic, that in order to do full tshuva with the vidui, you have to go to Eretz Yisrael. And the question is, why would I have said that you have to go to Eretz Yisrael on the basis of logic? But the answer is obvious. The essence of tshuva is returning to God. And how does one return to God? By sensing God's presence. And where is it easiest to sense God's presence? It's easiest in Eretz Yisrael, as the Captive of Patriarchs says. From the time of Avraham Avinu, there was a special dusha, a special sanctity in the land of Eretz Yisrael. And that was the dusha shechina, the sanctity of the presence of God. So even though one can reach out to God wherever he is, but one comes closest to God, one has the ability to sense God's presence greatest when he is in Eretz Yisrael. So on the basis of the logic, I would have suggested that the mitzvah of tshuva, of returning to God, of coming close to God, of asking God for forgiveness, is best fulfilled not by sending a letter, not by calling by the telephone, not by communication from afar, but by coming close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is done in Eretz Yisrael. So we could suggest that the explanation of the Ramban is that the purpose of Eretz Yisrael, part of the purpose of Eretz Yisrael, is for a Jew to feel close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to feel close to God. And in a sense, that's the purpose of the mitzvos also. The purpose of the mitzvos is to feel close to God. So therefore, the avos, they did not have the command of observing the mitzvos, but they observed the mitzvos. Why? They felt a compulsion. Not that it was required halachically, but they felt a compulsion to observe the mitzvos because the others always wanted to feel close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But that sense of closeness was felt in Eretz Yisrael. Consequently, we could suggest that according to the Ramban, that the reason the Avos felt the need in Eretz Yisrael to observe the Taryag mitzvahs is because they observed it because of that emotional sense of feeling close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of feeling close to God. And now, I saw once, I think it was in the Das Gen with Balei Tosfos, I didn't search this time, but there are those who answer in a different way. And they say, how was Yakov able to marry? And according to the Ramban, so Yaakov got married to the two sisters outside the land of Eretz Yisrael. And I did see somewhere, it's not the, that it was suggested that according to the Ramban, it might have been even in the Ramban itself, that after they entered Eretz Yisrael, so Yaakov only lived with one of the two sisters. And we know that Rachel died shortly after they entered Eretz Yisrael. Right after Binyamin was born. So that's in line with the Shita of the Ramban, that the Avos only fulfilled the Taryag mitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael, not in Chutz La'aretz. However, I want to suggest a different explanation. Now, to this question. Now, but I want to mention some other questions also. Now, Tosfos and that Beis in Maseches Gittin. So it's mentioned there that Rechem, the city Rechem, was in Chutz La'aretz, was outside the land of Eretz Yisrael. And Tosfos shows that Kadesh in the Torah, Kadesh was, the Targum says, was Rechem. And we know that Avraham and Yitzchak Avraham lived in Rechem. Ben Kadesh uvein Shur. He lived between Rechem and Shur, which Shur was Chagor. So on one hand, from the Mishnah, it appears that Rechem and Chagor, well, Rechem was outside Eretz Yisrael, outside the land of Israel. On the other hand, it appears that Rechem was part of Eretz Yisrael. So Tosfos says there were two Rechems. And he says, how do we know there was a Rechem inside Eretz Yisrael? He says, because logic dictates that Avraham and Yitzchak would not have lived outside Eretz Yisrael. And the question arises, what do you mean logic dictates? We know that Avraham lived outside Eretz Yisrael. He went down to Egypt. According to some opinions, for a short while, Avraham actually returned to Ur Kasdim, to his hometown, and then returned to Eretz Yisrael. So how is it possible to suggest that just to assume, I shouldn't say suggest can suggest anything, but to assume that Avraham, Yitzchak, we know, was not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Yitzchak to stay in Eretz Yisrael. Yitzchak was thinking, because of a famine, to follow the paths of Avraham and go down to Egypt. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu shchon baretz, stay in the land, gur baretz. But Avraham did leave Eretz Yisrael. So why does Tosfos in the beginning of Gittin assume that cities where Avraham was had necessarily to be part of Eretz Yisrael? Because Avraham would not leave Eretz Yisrael. And then there is a similar question on the Sforna. We know that Yakov, before he went down to Egypt, when he heard, Yosef Chai, that his son, Yosef, was still alive. And his son Yosef was the Mishnah Lamelech. He was the second to Paro in Egypt. So Yaakov decided, I'll go see my son Yosef. But he had pangs of conscience. Some say his original plan was just to see Yosef, not to live there. Whatever it was. So it says he gave zvachim, he gave korbanos to God of his father Yitzchak. And God appeared to him and told him, you could go down to Egypt and Yosef will close your eyes after you pass away and you'll return, whatever. And the Jewish people eventually return. But the question is, why, when he gave the korbanos, is it mentioned that is zvachim, it was korbanos, sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac, to the God of his father Yitzchak? And the Sforna says, because God told Yitzchak, don't go down to Egypt. So Yaakov wanted to, in a sense, establish communication, establish a connection with God in order to get direction, whether it would be okay for him to leave Eretz Yisrael. Now, in Yitzchak's case, we know there was no problem. Yitzchak was told by God. Some say because he was an Ola Tamima, because he was a korban, he wasn't allowed to leave. But it's explicit in the Torah that Yitzchak was not allowed to leave. But Yaakov, Vayeitzei Yakov Sheva Vayelech Harana, the beginning of this week's Sedra. So why was he scared? Why did he think maybe I'm not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael? Because God told my father not to leave Eretz Yisrael. He had already left Eretz Yisrael previously. A person could suggest, I don't think that's an explanation, but a person could suggest because here it was going down to Egypt. So the Yitzchak was told not to go down to Egypt, but Yitzchak was told, when he was told not to go down to Egypt, he was told to stay in Eretz Yisrael. It wasn't just a question of going down to Egypt. The assumption is that Yaakov was troubled by that command. So the question is, but Yaakov left. Vayeitzei Yaakov Be'ersheva, Vayelech Harana. So how are we to understand it? Now, also, this question is asked by many. Brisker Rav gives an answer. I saw an answer from the Lubavitcher Rabbi. The question is, we know that God appeared to Avraham, Parshas Lzecher, and he tells his Halech Lefanai v'heyei somim, walk before me, be complete, and he's given the mitzvah of bris milah, the mitzvah of circumcision. And the question everybody asks is, Avraham was in Eretz Yisrael. If he observed all the Taryag mitzvahs, if he observed all 613 mitzvahs, if the Avos observed it, so why did he wait from the command? Why didn't he fulfill the mitzvah of bris milah earlier? So what I think is we have to understand Avraham, now last week I discussed the issue of Yakov becoming an Av of Klal Yisrael. And what I want to suggest is, that when the Gemara says that the Avos observed all the mitzvahs of the Torah, it's only the Avos. The others in the Jewish people, they did not have the same compulsion. It's somehow being an Av of Klal Yisrael, being a patriarch of the Jewish people, gave them that psychological necessity to observe the mitzvahs of the Torah. So we have to determine at what point did Avraham become a patriarch, Yitzchak became a patriarch, and Yakov became a patriarch. And more than that, we have to question. We see a very interesting thing when it comes to the names. Avram's name was originally Avraham, but then God changed his name at the end of Parshas Lzecher, when he gets the mitzvah of bris milah, is changed to Avraham. Av Hamon Goyim Nisaticha. And the Gemara in Brachas at the end of the first parak says that one is not allowed to refer to Avraham as Avram. There is a question the Magen Avram raises. Why is it that none of the poskim, not the Rambam and not the Shulchan Aruch, why don't they mention this halacha? But one thing we see clear, that Avram's name was changed in such a manner that the name Avram is not used anymore. Yitzchak, on the contrary, Yitzchak, his name was never changed. His name remains Yitzchak. He was given that name at birth, and the name remains the same. Yakov, so he has the name Yaakov, and then he gets the name Yisrael. And the Gemara in Brachas asks the question, the same words that are used in regard to Avram's name changed is also used in regard to Yaakov's name changed. When it's changed from Yaakov to Yisrael, still we find that Yaakov retains his former name and only gets an additional name. Gemara says the name Yisrael is Iker, is the main name. Yaakov is secondary. In the Medrash, we find opinions both ways. But whatever it is, he retains both names. And the Gemara says, because we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, after he changed his name to Yisrael, called him Yaakov. But the question still remains, why is it that when Yaakov's name is changed from Yaakov to Yisrael, he retains the old name, whereas Avraham, Avram's name is changed and he does not retain his old name. Now, it's interesting that name change can be in one of two situations. Might be more situations also. A change of name is given very often when there's a change of identity. Matter of fact, when someone goes through Geirus, very often they change their name. Priyas Hashem, because Gershon is Gayer, Katan Shanol Adami. Someone who converts, it's like they have a new identity. So a name change is associated with a new identity. But we find that a name change can take place even when a person remains the same person. When a person receives a position in ancient times, and this is not only a biblical fact, you find it much later with emperors. Emperors, when somebody became an emperor, he took a new name. Yosef, when he came the Mishnah Lamelech to Paro, when he came Paro's assistant, so Paro called him Tzafnas Paneach. He gave him a new name. So new name can also be associated with a promotion, with a position. So we could suggest that that's the difference. That Avraham, the name, what I want to suggest is that the name change implied that Avraham and Yakov became the patriarchs of the Jewish people. They became the almost of the Jewish people. They assumed the rule, a position of leadership. A position of leadership, not just for their small group. And Avraham, by the way, had a large group. But they had assumed position of leadership for the Jewish people of all generations, being an Av of Klal Yisrael. But by Avraham, the name change was not just indicative of an aliyah legdula, assuming a higher position, a higher role. It was indicative of a change of identity. It was, to a certain degree, a rejection of his past identity. Consequently, the name Avraham, it was not just an additional name, but it was a negation of the name Avraham. Yitzchak, and it's at that point when he has his name change, and he's given the mitzvah bris milah, that Avraham becomes the father of the Jewish people. He becomes the Av of Klal Yisrael. Yitzchak was born an Av of Klal Yisrael. As I mentioned, Reb Chaim said, Ki b'Yitzchak yikar l'chazara. That implies two things. One thing is that Yishmael was eliminated at birth from being the successor to Avraham. Yitzchak at birth was the successor. But the Gemara says, Ki v'Yitzchak v'lo kol Yitzchak. From Yitzchak and not all of Yitzchak, that meant either Esav or Yakov would be the successor, but not both of them. So because of that, there had to be a way, they had to wait. First, for the determination to be made. Now, when Yaakov bought the Bechorah from Esav, so in a sense, from there he acquired the right to get the Bechorah. One of the questions that's asked, by what right did Yakov have to go and to lie and to say, Ani Esav Bechorecha? But the answer is, that was Yaakov's way of getting what was coming to him. But even at that point, it was not yet an Av of Klal Yisrael. It's only when Avraham, when he got the brachos, and he got both brachas, the mundane bracha and the spiritual bracha, that he was appointed as an Av of Klal Yisrael. But he did not become an Av of Klal Yisrael until he had a name change of Yisrael. Now, there is a discussion in the Mefarshim as to what the name Yisrael means. Rashi says that the name Yisrael means Ki sarisa im Elohim ve'im anoshim vatuchal. You fought with malachim, the Sarah Shel Esav, and you fought with people, and you were successful. But Targum Onkelos says Ki sarisa became Rav Revaya. You became an officer. It comes from the word sar. You became an officer with men and before God, and you were successful. So the name Yisrael, by its definition, denotes the idea of Yaakov becoming Rav Revaya, a sar, an officer. It denotes position. Denotes his becoming a patriarch of the Jewish people. And we could suggest when the Malach gave it to him, it was just indicative of the fact it was the Sarah Shel Esav, that Esav will eventually recognize Yaakov as the successor. And we see that to a certain degree, eventually he does recognize, he leaves for Har Seir. Yaakov Achiv. But when does he actually become the Av of Klal Yisrael? That's when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him the name. At the end of next week's Sedra. So, actually, I'm sorry, Sedra after that. So Vayishlach, at the end of Vayishlach. So it's only at that point that he becomes of Nab of Klal Yisrael. So that means that Yaakov was, at the time that he married Rachel and Leah, he was not yet an Ab of Klal Yisrael. He was appointed, but he did not become the Av of Klal Yisrael at that point yet. Consequently, the observance, he did not have that need of observing the Taryag mitzvahs. Now, and we could say the same thing about Avraham went down to Egypt. Yes, Avraham went down to Egypt, but that was before his name was changed to Avraham. Once his name was changed to Avraham, he never left Eretz Yisrael. Yitzchak was always an Av of Klal Yisrael. Yakov originally was not an Av of Klal Yisrael. And when he went to Haran, he was not yet an Av of Klal Yisrael. He might have been appointed. He was destined to be. Esav was eliminated from having a chance. But he did not assume that role yet of Av of Klal Yisrael until he got the name Yisrael. So consequently, but when the episode of Yosef took place and he was going down to Egypt, he was already an Av of Klal Yisrael for many years. So he was scared that maybe the fact that Yitzchak was the fact that Yitzchak was told not to go down to Egypt, the prohibition on Yitzchak applied to him also. Consequently, he gave Karbanos, he gave Zvachim, Yitzchak, the God of his father Yitzchak, who was told not to go down to Egypt, who was told, Shchon Baretz, stay in the land. And he obtained permission, perhaps special permission, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to go down to Egypt. Now, I want to add one thing. When my uncle, my mother's brother, Rabbi Yisrael Shuren, he was a son-in-law of Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, and he was also a Talmud in the Boston Kollel of my uncle, the Rav, Rabbi Yosher Ber. And he told me, and since that time, I see that it's mentioned, the story to some degree is mentioned in the Sefer, and without mentioning personalities, it's actually mentioned, the Torah that was said is mentioned in my uncle's Sefer, but he told it to me many, many years ago, And I think that the book, The Making of the Gadol, which is a biography of Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky by his son, also makes a quick reference to the story that many years ago, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, this probably shortly after he came to America, went to Boston. And according to what my uncle, Rabbi Yisrael, told me, and this is in the biography also, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky one time wanted to, I assume it was at that visit, he wanted to start a yeshiva together with my uncle. And in the morning, and so apparently he was staying at my uncle's house. And the way my uncle, Rabbi Yisrael, writes it over in his sefer. And Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky's practice was every morning to learn Tanakh. And that morning, he was learning about Shaul and David. And he asked the question as to what the status after David was appointed king by Shmuel, but before he took over the government, so to say. So what was his status? You could say Melech-elect, if I'm to use contemporary terms. Okay, so what was the status what was the status of David, and what was the status of Shlomo? So he asked those questions to my uncle. According to my uncle, Rabbi Yoshe, he asked him, because that's what he was learning at the time. My uncle was very impressed with those questions, and he said to him, "Are you mi beis Abba?" In other words, those were questions that Reb Chaim would have raised. So that was what my uncle said. But my uncle said in the answering, he said, you have a din of Melech and you have a din of Malchus. And Melech, in other words, David was a Melech from the time Shmuel appointed him. But he did not have Malchus till later. And there are certain laws of Melech that are dependent upon Malchus. It says, "V'haya kishivto al kisei mamlachto because of a sefer Mishnah HaTorah Zos." A king has to write a special sefer Torah. He does not fulfill the mitzvah if he writes it before he assumes control. Even though he was appointed king, and even though he was king, he was anointed as king. But kishivto kisei mamlachto, it's only when he has control over, when he has malchus also. And of course, and there are Gemaras and Megillah that could be explained with that the king, the halacha of mored b'malchus, even though there's a mitzvah of kavod hamelech, of giving honor to the king, but the mitzvah of mored b'malchus, din of mored b'malchus, being chayiv misa, that does not take effect until he assumes control over the country, over the people, over the nation. Until he has malchus. Mored b'malchus. So I want to suggest that perhaps that Yakov, perhaps when he was told, "V'yitein lecha es birchas Avraham," you should get the blessing of Avraham. So he became a melech already. He became a melech. But his reign, melech, not a melech, became an av of Klal Yisrael. He was an Av of Klal Yisrael, but his reign as the Av of Klal Yisrael did not take effect yet until he was given the name Yisrael. So the Shvatim were born to an Av of Klal Yisrael. But he did not yet have all the authority of an Av of Klal Yisrael. And with this, we could answer the question about, we know in this week's Sedra, Yaakov tikein Tefila Sarvis. Vayifga b'makom. Vayolon sham kivo hashemesh. And there's a question that's asked by many, many achronim. There are many terutzim. I have a number of terutzim myself, but it's not our Inyan. But the question is, why is it the Tefila of Avraham, if we say the Tefilos Avos Tiknum, that the Patriarchs are the ones who instituted the Tefilos? So Avram Tikein Tefila Shachris. Avram instituted Shachris. Shachris is a required Tefila. Mincha. Yitzchak Tikein Tefila Mincha. It was a required Tefila. But Yaakov Tikein Tefila Sarvis. Yaakov instituted Tefila Sarvis. It was not yet a required Tefila. Why wasn't it a required Tefila? And the answer is, because at that point, Yaakov was not an Av of Klal Yisrael, or if he was an Av of Klal Yisrael, he did not have that position of authority as an Av of Klal Yisrael. Consequently, he was not able to impose on future generations Tefila Sarvis as a requirement. So Tefila Sarvis is a rishus. It is a voluntary tefillah. Today, we accepted it upon ourselves, all the Rishonim say. There are other answers also, and it has to do with Machlokas Rishonim, but that's it. And then, with this, we could answer also how Avraham was able to marry Keturah. Because the Turah was Hagar, and Hagar was a mistress. And a Jew is not allowed to marry a mistress. But we could, now my uncle says, regarding Parshas Chayesara, that if you take a look at Avraham, it's almost that Avram's role as an Av of Klal Yisrael comes to an end when Avram's role comes to an end when Sarah dies. He's only involved with preparing for the next generation in terms of what the Torah tells us. Not what he was involved. The Torah only tells us about, to a large degree, what Avraham did in preparing the way for Yitzchak, in preparing the future. Other than that, it just tells us about the process of the process of Yitzchak taking over as an Av of Klal Yisrael. So Avraham was only an Av of Klal Yisrael from the point he was a Nav of Klal Yisrael together with Sarah. But once Yitzchak begins the process of marrying Rivka, so once that process begins, Yitzchak becomes the reigning Av of Klal Yisrael. Avraham remains an Av of Klal Yisrael, remains a patriarch, but he's not the reigning patriarch anymore. Yitzchak becomes the reigning patriarch of Klal Yisrael. Consequently, he's able to institute Tfilas Mincha. As a matter of fact, so we could suggest the Das Ken Baal Tosfos gives two other answers. He says that Avram was a ger, and a ger is allowed to marry a mitzvah. The Brisker Rav did not like that approach that Avram was a ger, but he felt that Avram was not a ger. A ger is someone who enters into Klal Yisrael. Avram was the foundation of Klal Yisrael. Okay, and then he says it was al pi hadibur. It was a special. It was by heaven. Heaven told Avram through Ruach HaKodesh. He was told to marry Turah for whatever reason. But the simple explanation we could answer that at that point Yitzchak became the reigning Av of Klal Yisrael. And since he was the reigning Av of Klal Yisrael, matter of fact, he marries Keturah after Yitzchak married Rivka. So we could answer the Das Ken Baal Tosfos question that at that point Avraham was no longer the reigning Av of Klal Yisrael, and I think. The idea, is, why was it necessary for the Avos to observe? Why did they feel that it was necessary for them to observe Taryag mitzvahs? And I think the answer is, we don't observe Taryag mitzvahs because the Avos observed it. The Avos observed it because we observed it. Ki yadativ. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, "He yadativ, I love Avram, Laman Asher Yitzava es Bonav es Beis Avram." He commands his house and his family after him. After him means after he dies, but my father said after him also means after him by his example. If we want to be, when it came to halacha, when it came to mitzvos, so the source is Moshe Rabbeinu through HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course. But when it came to character traits, when it came how to act, the source is the Avos. The Avos taught not by what they said, but what they did. And consequently, and this is a lesson, of course, we have to teach our children what the halacha is. We have to have the approach of Moshe Rabbeinu. But the Torah keeps the Avos alive. The Torah keeps the Avos alive. Why? That we should learn from the way they live their lives. And our children have to learn from the way we live our lives. We have to conduct our lives in a manner that will teach our children and our grandchildren how to properly act. Manya Shi'etzaves Bano Beis of Achrav, after him, by his example. And when it's by his example, it'll be even, the impact will be there even after they're no longer there. Okay.
So we have a few questions. One question is, so Yakov started Marav before he was an Av, but he still davened it when he was an Av. So why didn't it become an obligation?
Because it originated beforehand.
Okay. Someone's asking what made Yitzchak and Av. I don't think anything made him. Well, I'll let you answer.
Kivi Yitzchak Yikar Chazara. That's what made Yitzchak and Av. Kivi Yitzchak, from Yitzchak shall be your descendants.
I guess want to focus that the fact is that yet Yaakov had potential to be Av, but something else had to happen to actually make him an Av. Yitzchak, it was
That's
automatic.
Right. Automatic, yes.
Okay. Another interesting question. Why wasn't David HaMelech or those Malachim, why weren't their names changed when they became Melech?
Okay. My sense is that it probably wasn't necessary when it became Melech. That's my sense. But by the way, David had many names anyway. But apparently it wasn't necessary.
Maybe Yosef needed the name change since he wasn't originally Egyptian, so making the name change
Egyptian,
showed that he was one of them.
Where it was necessary, they gave the name change.
Yeah. Was there any concern? So you mentioned about Yakov was afraid to go down to Mitrayam when he was told Yosef was alive. Was there any? Do you think there was any concern on Yaakov's part that Esav might try to harm him, and that's why he didn't want to leave Mitrayam, go down to Mitrayam?
Esav would harm who?
Yaakov.
I mean, why should we think that? Esav was in Harseir at that point.
Okay, I know.
The only time he started up was by the Maris Machpelah.
Okay. I'm just passing along the question.
My sense is that at the Maris Machpelah, it wasn't so much that he didn't want his own nation. He wanted his own nation, but it could be that he wanted the Yavos to be identified with his lineage rather than with Yitzchak's lineage, with the lineage of Yaakov. It's more that he wanted Avraham and Yitzchak to be considered his predecessors rather than he being their successors.
Okay, this question. I'll try to. I don't fully understand it, but if Avram's reign as an Av ended when Sarah died, then when Avram gave the gifts to the sons of Keturah, did he really have the authority to give those gifts?
Well, it was his property. It was his property. He certainly had the rights to give it.
So whether he was an Av or whether not Av, he would have been able to.
That was his property. Yeah, sure. By the way, yeah, okay, that's fine.
Someone asked, do we have a date when Yaakov's family officially descended to Mitrayam?
I'm sure there are many different theories. I don't know any of them, though. I would suggest you look in Rabbi Hertz's Chumash, and I'm sure that he deals with that problem. Not necessarily in the commentary, but in the notes in the back of the Chumash, Bereshis, he might deal with that. He wouldn't say exact date, but he'll probably give around who was the paro at that time. Could be it's the end of Shemos. He discusses the kings at the end of Shemos. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't see any other questions here. Thank you, Yasher Koach.
Thank you.
Thank you. What a share. Those are some of the comments. Okay. Thank you very much for everyone for coming. Thank you, Rabbi, for giving the share.